before we get down to the real detail of qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix, understand this. Charles Leclerc did not get out of Q1. Sergio Perez and George Russell did not get out of Q2. And Fernando Alonso had such a big lose in Q2 at the last corner, a great corner, the new fast corner, that his car wasn't quite right for Q3. Yes, he made it through to Q3, you could say that, but he was out-qualified by his teammate Lance Stroll in the Aston Martin. So we got that out of the way. One of the heroes of the day, undoubtedly Carlos Sainz, the Spaniard, who qualified second. He'll be on the front row in the Ferrari alongside Max Verstappen, who was absolutely stunning, brilliant, without flaw, whatever you want to say, whatever the superlatives do not sum up Max's performance today. So let's get down to the detail of what that pole of Max's was all about. Q1 started with light drizzle, but then that went away and the track was dry then for the rest of Q1, Q2 and Q3, but it was not warm at all. And bear in mind, this is the second hardest in the Pirelli range of compounds that they run all year. So the big issue today in qualifying was tyre temperature, getting the tyres to work. Whenever you see enormous swings like this, Charles Leclerc can't get any grip in the car. Whenever you see Sergio Perez locking up, you know there's a tyre temperature issue. Whenever you see Fernando Alonso having a big lose in the middle of a fast corner, you know there's a tyre temperature issue. Tyre temperature is a very, very odd thing in motor racing, very difficult to handle, to anticipate, and to react to. But here's what Max did. This is only my opinion, but it's as much my opinion as his qualifying was defined by Rascasse at Monaco. Throughout the day, and to some extent yesterday, it struck me that Max was using longer corners than he normally has. Still the lovely, soft, supple input, still absolutely seamless in the way he goes from the straight into the corner. But there's no denying that coming out of turn 2, going into turn 3, very good example where you really need to get the tyres working for the rest of the lap. He was leaning on the car more going into turn 3. He was definitely making more move than he normally would have on a hot day in Barcelona last year, year before that. There was definitely this arc. And I was watching him today in FP3 thinking, wow, that's interesting that Max is doing that. And look at Sergio Perez. He has got anything like the same arc. He's actually looking like Max Verstappen on a normal day through there. And I think that was what it was. I think Max, probably with Adrian Newey in his ear, was focused 100% on just driving those tyres as hard as he, Max, who's not a massively hard white-knuckle driver anyway, but his way of driving them hard is just to make the corners a little bit longer and just to lean on them a little bit more before the rotation point. And that's what he was clearly doing. You could see it between 2 and 3. You could see it into turn 4. He got the tyres really working through turn 4. And then it was kind of okay. I mean, he was flat through turn 9, flat through the last corner. None of the dramas that some of the other drivers were having. Sergio Perez, as I say, was very, very smooth. Very, very little movement in change of direction between 2 and 3. Looked brilliant through there. But then the thought occurred, is he getting the tyres up to temperature? Is he actually going to get these tyres to work? And sure enough, on the lap that mattered in Q2, under pressure, he lost the rear going into the tight hairpin and went off into the boonies and did another lap, but that was it. There was enough fuel in the car to do that lap, but the car was damaged, there was gravel, and he didn't get through. And this was very similar to what we saw in qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix, when it was a similar thing. You know, couldn't get the feel from the front, kept locking the fronts when Max had no problem at all. And Sergio didn't get through. So absolutely calamitous performance, again, from Sergio Perez to go off in Q2 in a car as good as a Red Bull, in a car that Max Verstappen was taking a peerless pole with. Charles Leclerc, I think, made the same mistake. And I was hoping, and this sounds incredibly pretentious, but I was hoping that somebody out there, presumably it was going to be Frederic Vasseur, the new team principal at Ferrari, was going to be in his ear saying, Charles, whatever you do, cane these tyres, get sideways. That's what Carlos Sainz is doing. You know how he drives. He's got temperature. You've got to drive like Carlos Sainz around this lap. And I wonder whether anybody at Ferrari said that to him. I suspect not, because he just continued to drive around like Charles Leclerc, very, very neat and tidy, looking for all the world like Sergio Perez through most of the corners, and couldn't get any temperature. George Russell, similar thing. I said in the live stream, I haven't put them up yet, and I will do that in a video coming up shortly, next week, I guess, of the comparison between George and Lewis going into Rascasse at Monaco, which is a significant thing that stands up even this weekend for the Spanish Grand Prix, because it shows how drivers are getting into corners, whether they're trying to shorten the corner, how well they're doing that if they're trying to do that, or whether they're staying a little bit wider, waiting to feel the rear of the car. And I made the point, teasing the point, that in what I could see in the photography that I did, that George actually had shorter corners going into that section than Lewis Hamilton. And I've been thinking about that ever since. And I'm wondering whether, ever since they put on this B spec of the car, that Lewis's only way of getting a real feel for the car is to throw it around a bit in a way that he's never done before, slightly longer corners. And we've seen him being very aggressive with the car, particularly at Monaco. And here, I made the comment yesterday, in the video yesterday, that Lewis is looking quite sidewaysy in the way he's driving. And I think that's what happened. I think that's what he was doing, and he was getting temperature. And I think George is sort of being very, very super smooth George, trying to get better all the time, if you like, and couldn't get the tyres to work. I'd like to say it was as simple as that, but of course it wasn't, because there was an unbelievably dangerous incident right at the end of Q2. And this doesn't come under the heading of any of the comments I've been making about it's a good job that to some extent that Mercedes don't have a race-winning, championship-winning car, because if they did, there would be major fireworks between Lewis and George. It doesn't come under that heading, because giving George the benefit of the doubt, I would say that he's used to getting warnings from his radio to say if there's anybody behind him, particularly if it's Lewis. And he didn't look in his mirrors as a result. But he did an unbelievably dangerous thing nonetheless. He pulled out behind Carlos Sainz's Ferrari, which had slowed down a bit, and he pulled out to the middle of the track on the main straight, unknowing that Lewis was approaching him much faster and was on the outside, and just basically drove Lewis off the track. And Lewis hadn't backed off. He got on the radio straight away, Lewis, and said George backed off, which suggests that George had sort of finished his lap and was just cruising out behind from the toe of Sainz and not really thinking about what was going on. But the speed differential suddenly became much too great for Lewis to be able to react to. Because when he's approaching George and when he's approaching Sainz, he's looking at, obviously, what speed and what moment he's going to be doing that pass. And if George suddenly slows, the whole thing just goes out the window. I'd like to say that I think Lewis's reaction was unbelievable. That, to me, is the most dangerous situation you can have in racing. We saw it with Lance Stroll in the US Grand Prix with Fernando Alonso. Incredibly lucky that wasn't worse than it was. And this one, I mean, that was incredibly high speed at which Lewis was touched. And for him to be able to react a little bit with the steering and just keep the car balanced and straight, and then to come in, new front wing or whatever it was, and sit in the car and then go out and be pretty good in Q3, heart pounding, I would imagine, was one of the great performances in Formula One that I've seen, actually. I think that was just outstanding what Lewis did today, because that was a horrendous situation. And it was George. I mean, how Mercedes must be feeling about that, I don't know. They must be thinking, wow, that was lucky. But they need to be doing something about that, because either George's crew were not on the ball and telling what was going on, or George was half asleep, one of the two. And I suppose it's also an indictment for the mirrors and the lack of vision. They're supposedly much better now in the new positions. But, if that's the case, why isn't George looking in the mirrors? And I mean, you see drivers looking in the mirrors. I saw the start of the F2 race. The restart of the F2 race, Frederick Vesti was in the lead, got the lead, and the first thing he did was looking in his mirrors going into turn one just to make sure he knew where everybody was. But why wasn't George doing that? I just find it unbelievable, really. I suppose it's only because they get lulled into thinking that if there's something like that about to happen, i.e. a quicker car, particularly your teammate coming up behind you, they will tell him on the radio. But that's playing with fire, because radio doesn't always work anyway. Anyway, there was that. Then there was Max getting impeded in turn 4 by Pierre Gasly in the Alpine, which Fernando saw, and even Fernando complained about to his radio, to his team, saying that was ridiculous, for sure Gasly's going to get a penalty. And indeed, as I speak, they're up there now giving evidence. And that was at the second run for Max in Q2, and it was relatively important because his margin at that point was less than a second over the bubble. So he needed to be out there doing a quick lap. As it was, he was okay, but it could have been a big problem. It could have been a major problem. And, Pierre Gasly's pretty good generally, but I suppose it's also a function of everybody trying to get tyre temperature. Everybody's all over the place. I mean, Q1, they stopped Q1 after about 5 minutes because about 5 cars had gone off and they've red flagged it because there's so much gravel everywhere. Nick de Vries was quite funny, I thought. He went off twice coming out of turn 10, which is the left-hand hairpin at the end of the long back straight, just on power. And the second time he said, what am I doing wrong here? I thought it was actually quite good. I know he was joking, but I thought it was quite good to hear a racing driver actually admit that he was doing something wrong. And he needs to be talking to Sergio Perez, would be my advice, Nick. If you want to know how to put the power down, traction control-like way, in a traction control-like way, go and talk to Sergio Perez. He may not give you any hints, but, or better still, go and do some work with Rob Wilson. He'd be pretty good on that. Anyway, moving on from that. So Charles Leclerc didn't get through. That's a huge thing. Going back to Ferrari now. It's bouncing all over the place, a bit like qualifying. So Charles Leclerc didn't get through. And I made this comment before, when your star teammate has a problem, whether he crashes or isn't quick or whatever, it's always a boost for you in the other car because all of a sudden you're the guy getting it right. And Carlos was just doing what Lando Norris was doing at McLaren. He's just driving the normal Carlos Sainz laps. I said yesterday, he's in a great groove at the moment, has been all year, apart from Baku, really, which was really the fallout from that ridiculous decision that was taken at the end of the Australian Grand Prix. But he's been driving really well in that sort of Rubens Barrichello-like groove, and just looking very, very, what's the word? Sharp, I guess, is the right word. And so he was just doing what he continued to do. What he did. And every time he went out, he was getting the tyre temperature that Charles wasn't. And he put in the lap. And he's on the front row. Brilliant. He's on the front row because Fernando messed up Q2 in the Aston, didn't get great tyre temperature. And in the middle of the last corner, if you get a little bit up on the curb, as Logan Sargent found out in Q1, or was it in FP3? I don't know. Can't remember now. It can lift you off, a little bit like the curbs at the exit of the swimming pool at Monaco. It can just lift you off and you straight into the boonies. And that's what happened to Fernando. He kept the thing away from the Tech Pro barrier and then came in, but there was a lot of work needed to be done to the car, the underside of the car, the floor, and he only did one run in Q3, and it wasn't enough, and presumably the car was damaged. And as I said yesterday, and in the live stream, when I kind of predicted that Lance Stroll would have a better weekend than of late, because I didn't think his father would take it anymore, that, Fernando's doing everything and Lance is being sidelined. They did look as if they got a much better balance on that car for Lance, a bit more understeer in the car, I would imagine. I'm only guessing. And in that situation, he could do quite a lot to get the temperature, and he's doing a really good job with the tyre warm-up and put in the lap. Now, I'm not sure that out-qualifying Fernando will carry any weight to all the Fernando fans, for us Fernando fans, because you can say, well, he had that off and the car wasn't very good. But I don't think that should be underplayed too much, because Lance Stroll didn't go off. And if you'd spoken to anybody last week who's going to go off in those conditions, you'd probably say, oh, Lance Stroll. But he didn't. And he did a pretty good job. And there he is, whatever he is. Let's have a look. P6 on the grid. So let's just go through the grid. Max, as I say, absolutely superb, using longer corners. So this is a thing. People think, the Max Verstappen way of driving. That's how he got the pole at Monaco. Incredible how he goes in early. But the great thing about Max is he's absolutely touch and feel, and he feels the wind. Oh yeah, tyre temperature is the issue here. I need to drive in a tyre temperature generating way. And I'm not going to do what Carlos Sainz does, but what I might do is just use the front a little bit more on some of those quick corners just to get the temperature in the tyre. That's what he was doing. I don't think anybody else was thinking that way. I think it kind of happened for them naturally, but I think Max adjusted. And I wonder whether anybody, just to make the point again, I wonder whether anybody at Ferrari was watching the way Max Verstappen was driving and passing that news on to Charles Leclerc. I doubt it. I'd like to think they were, but I doubt it. I mean, if they were, then Charles didn't respond. So, and that to me is what good management is all about. That's what should have been happening. Because when you see some drivers getting temperature and some not, you've got to look at the way they drive. It is what they're doing with the steering, the throttle and the brakes that's giving them that temperature. So there's no magic out there. It's nothing to do with telemetry. It's just, look what he's doing with the car. Wasn't difficult, in a way, to work it out. Max Verstappen, longer corners, getting the tyres to work, and then benefiting from everything that's brilliant about that Red Bull and the management at Red Bull as well. And keeping a very calm head in various situations. He hadn't done a time when the first red came out, for example, and it could have been wet for the remainder of Q1. It wasn't. It was dry, but even so, massive amount of traffic and not a lot of time which to make sure he got into Q2, as we found out from Charles Leclerc. Carlos Sainz, P2, on the front row of the grid. We got a Spaniard on the front row of the grid. A massive crowd. And I suspect most of it is all the fired up Alonso fan base here in Spain. But I think some of it might be gravitating towards Carlos Sainz because he did a really, really good job. And he is in a Ferrari as well. So it's a pretty nice thing. And he's a pretty cool guy. And he's on the front row, which is great, isn't it? Lando Norris, P3. So Lando was just... Lando, you're P3. What? You're P3. Really? Just wonderful. And I've been going on about Lando, about how I feel his style is being a bit cramped by the arrival of Oscar Piastri. But I still really rate him. And had a phone call from an ex-Grand Prix driver the other day who was ringing up to say how good he thought Oscar Piastri was. And I totally agree with that. He is very good. But then he went off to slag Lando, saying, Lando's very overrated and this and that. And I said, well, I disagree. I think Lando is really good, but I'm not sure that it's going to bring the best out of him. And, having the whole Piastri thing there. And anyway, we had a bit of a tussle about that. And that was the end of the story. And then I made the point that Lando, to me, has just about everything except short corners. He's quite a long corner driver. And guess what worked today? Long corners. So there he was in the Max Verstappen zone, long corners, getting tyre temperature, and the rest of it was history. McLaren done a pretty good job. And there they were, ahead of Alpine, who were brilliant at Monaco. But as I said in the build-up to the race, I always felt that the powertrain disadvantage, which is pretty obvious with the Renault, would hurt them more at Barcelona than it did at Monaco. And there's Lewis, who, despite almost having a massive shunt with his teammate at the end of Q2, went round through the Mercedes round, threw it around. I've never said that about Lewis before. But it's almost like he's like a puppy with a ball. He's just so annoyed by everything that he's right, I'm just going to drive this thing as hard as I can possibly drive it. I'm just going to go for it. And it worked today, kind of. I mean, only P5 was his reward. I'd like to think that if he hadn't had that shunt, he probably would have been on top three. Probably would have been ahead of Lando, I think. What was the gap in the end? Lando 12.7, Lewis 12.8. Yeah, not a lot in it. Very little in it. I think if he hadn't had that shunt, Lewis would have been P3. Which means what? Mercedes have finally got a car now. They've done their upgrades, and it's a quicker car than the Aston Martin. Probably a little bit early to say that because Fernando didn't get the best from the car at all. And Lance Stroll's time probably more representative of what that Aston can do. And what did he do, actually? Let's just have a look. Lance Stroll, 12.9, and Lewis, 12.8. So, it was very, very close. And I think the problem with Fernando is that, he was driving a little bit like Perez. Everything was, trying to keep things as smooth as possible. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, he wasn't... And I think the place you notice this most is between 2 and 3 and how much they move the car across, because that is always asking a lot of the tyres if you've got to do that. And Nico Hulkenberg does that quite a lot, and he was really quick. And to me, that was just bang. That was it. And get the temperature. And I don't think Fernando was doing that there anymore. Perez was, or Leclerc. And because of that, he was always struggling with temperature throughout the lap. And the Aston wasn't brilliantly quick in a straight line compared with the Mercedes. So there you go. That's what happened. But it's a little bit early to say that Mercedes are now definitively quicker than Aston Martin, I think. Although this is it's a good thing. What we could say is that it's definitively slower than McLaren. Going all over the place, isn't it? So Oscar Piastri, top 10. Unbelievable, eh? Very good. McLaren, 3rd and 10th. Just behind Fernando Alonso. Sergio Perez, 11th. George Russell, 12th. And then Guanyu Zhou, good job. Nick De Vries. I thought Nick De Vries did a really good job throughout the weekend. Has done a really good job. And I'm getting to really enjoy his radio commentary and his general lightness of touch when it comes to humour. And I've got Rob Wilson's number if you need it, Nick. And he out-qualified Yuki. Just 13.5, 13.8 in Q1, 14.0, 14.4 in Q2. So it's pretty comprehensive. On Valtteri Bottas, Kevin Magnussen, Alexander Albon, and then the last two that never made it out of Q1, Charles Leclerc and Logan Sargent. Oof. Wow. You know, what a horrendous thing. We heard Charles saying unbelievable. But then in typical Charles way, he was out there in the garage watching what was going on the pit wall afterwards, looking nice and humble and normal. But I'm sure he's absolutely seething inside. But I'm not sure he knows what he's seething about any more than Perez. I mean, Perez sort of just grabs at whatever happens to be around. It could be the brakes are terrible, or now it's probably going to be, I don't know what, the rear brakes, front brakes, I don't know, some brake problem for sure. Non-existent brake problem. And they don't understand, really, that it's about temperature, tyre temperature, and getting the tyres to work. And that's the beauty of Max Verstappen. He got it. Because it would have been quite easy for Max to have driven a normal Max lap and not got the tyres to work. And it wouldn't have been just like 0.2 slower. If the tyres don't work, he could have been a second a lap slower. And the pole could have gone to Carlos Sainz. I think you needed to drive that Red Bull exactly as Max drove it in order to get it to work. And we saw what happened when Perez didn't get it to work. I think that was the beauty of Max's pole. Absolutely brilliant. There was a little bit of a cameo wet session this morning after it started dry, then it went wet. And I've put those times up. Just nobody, this is not significant in terms of definitive times in the wet, but it's what happened in the wet, and the track was changing all the time, and some drivers were out and some weren't. But you can see there Fernando was quickest, 23.1. He did two good runs to do the 23.1. Max really only did that one lap, 23.2. The first lap, the track was a lot slower, a lot wetter. Valtteri Bottas, Nick de Vries, again, very good, P4 in the wet. George, not bad, and Perez sort of there or thereabouts, but not in Max territory. Lewis wasn't out. He was out, but he didn't do a flying lap. And but then Lando, right at the end, Lando Norris did a 21.6 as the track was drying. But if anything, perhaps gave Lando a little bit even more confidence than he normally has anyway. It was maybe that lap in the semi-wet as the track was drying, but they're all on intermediate still. And he would have thought, wow, yeah, good lap. And then it went to dry again. Right at the end, it wasn't a. In fact, Max got a bit annoyed with his crew because everybody was out doing times at the end on soft tyres. And Max said, this is completely ridiculous. Why are we doing it? The track's still not mega quick and there's too much traffic. I'm not going to get involved. And they said, oh, well, everybody else is trying, Max. And Max then used an expletive to describe what he thought about worrying about what everybody else was doing, which was quite appropriate, I thought. Why would he? I mean, he does what he does and he thinks. And if Max was, if Max didn't think that way, he may not have twigged that the way to get the temperatures to work was just to sort of lean on the tyres a bit more and make the entrance to the corners a little bit longer than normal. But he can do it, and he can drive that well. He can drive in a million different ways. He can drive in the Carlos Sainz way, and he can be Max Verstappen. Wow. Chameleon Max. Brilliant. So, yeah, congratulations to Fred Vesti. Wow. He won the feature race at Monaco from the pole. And today, he didn't have a great qualifying yesterday, but today he won the sprint race, which was a reverse top half. And he won it going away, really, initially from Victor Martins, who's quick, and then from his old nemesis. I say old, he's unbelievably young, but his nemesis, Théo Pourchaire. And he won in the wet, and it was just wonderful to see a driver of that talent. Very short corners, got the car to work beautifully. Prema, great job in preparation. And good that the Crown Prince of Denmark had been invited by Fred's management team to this race, I guess on the back of Monaco. And he was there. The Crown Prince was there. Also another Frederick, to watch this. It's lovely when things come together in motorsport, isn't it? When a driver who's obviously looking for backing to take the next step, what would it be potentially for a guy like Fred Vesti? Oh, let's go to the royal family. And they're there. Wow. Not that they'll put any money in, but they might have a bit of influence. Who knows? So congratulations to him. That was really, really good to see. Brilliant. Okay, so that was qualifying. Loved it. So much to talk about. I've probably forgotten a whole lot of stuff, but I think they're the key issues. And a big thanks, of course, to Jetcraft and to Pitbox.io two partners with which we work in this channel and details of what they do. They do a brilliant job in the aviation industry and in the motorsport industry. Can be found in the description of this video. So I'll be back again tomorrow to talk about the race, the Spanish Grand Prix. Will it be another Max Verstappen domination? Will it be another Max masterclass, as it was today, as it has been for most of the year? Or will the Spaniards potentially, if something happens with Max, everything can happen in motor racing, potentially there might be a Spanish win. And it might not be Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin. Might be a red Ferrari. Who knows? See you then.